I want to introduce our speaker tonight, Lambis Englezos, OAM. Lambis is well known among many people who have been interested in World War I. He's energetic, and the term has been used colourful, but his great passion is, or a magnificent obsession, is as he describes it, is to honour the missing diggers from the Battle of Fromelles in July 1916. He's a Greek-born Australian, but he arrived here when he was 1, so he doesn't have huge memories of being in Greece. An art teacher for many years, a retired art teacher, and now has a love of lawn bowls, but I'm not sure quite how you would have time for lawn bowls anymore.
I find time.
You make time to have that happen. So, and for all of this work, many years, which he will explain now, he has been awarded an OAM. But I want Lambis to tell you the story of how all this came about, what was discovered, what was hidden, and what is happening still, because there are some local connections that we'll talk about a little bit later. So, Lambis, welcome, and thank you for coming down.
Thank you, Joy, for the invitation and the introduction. Amateur historian and ratbag would have covered it just nicely. Now, any work that I have done in the field of commemoration and remembrance, I dedicate to the memory of the World War I soldiers that I have met. I consider myself very fortunate to have shared their company and their companionship. In the case of the Battle of Fromelles, to the 19th of July men, the survivors of the Battle of Fromelles. The 19th of July, 1916, the very first time Australians going to battle on the Western Front. Fromelles is in the north of France, up near the Belgian border. There had been some skirmishing, some raiding and some artillery, but the 19th of July was the very first time that we're going to battle. This is VC Corner Cemetery. It is a unique cemetery. There are no headstones here. On the back wall is the honour roll to the missing of that one night's battle, carved 1,299 names. There should be 1,336. 37 of those killed and missing were listed at the Villers Brettoneux Memorial, a clerical error in 1916, compounded in 2010. In the grounds of the cemetery, 410 Australian soldiers, their bodies gathered after armistice. The majority of the missing were left out in no man's land for more than 3 years before their bodies could be recovered. This is Father Dahiez. He's the village priest of Fromelles. This photograph probably taken in the spring or the summer of 1919 or 1920. And here he is kneeling before the remains of an Australian or a British soldier killed that night. Now, it is very easy Australian sport to denigrate British generalship. This is Sir Richard Haking. He was in charge of the Battle of Fromelles. His own British soldiers gave him the title of Butcher. They called him Butcher Haking. He was in charge of the Battle of Aubers Ridge the year before, fought over the same ground, which met with a similar result. But as I said, his own British soldiers gave him that title. Now, the real reason why we like this photograph, history, like research, is fluid and ongoing. I draw your attention to the gentleman on the far right there. We don't know who he is, but he does have an excellent moustache. One of these days we're going to find out who he is. He looks a little bit like Hercule Poirot's uncle, I think. One day we'll find out who he is. This is a remarkable photograph, actually taken on the night of the battle. In some of the other aerial photographs, you can actually see the shadows of the Australian soldiers as they advance across no man's land towards the German lines. We'll spend a little bit of time on the battle. Up there, that area is the village of Fromelles. Here we have the Australian line and the German line. The length of that line is duplicated to the right by the British, who also attacked that night. The whole idea of the Battle of Fromelles, it was meant to be a feint, a trick, try and fool the Germans into thinking there was a major attack going to happen here, so the German troops could be held in place and not sent down to the Somme, where a major battle had already begun, and where the Australians would attack on the 23rd of July at Pozières. If indeed that was the tactic, had we not attacked, it would have been a success, because the Germans would have waited and waited for something to happen, but at about 6 in the evening on the 9th of July, we attack. Now, the features. On the left of the line, it's only 100 yards wide, but it gets wider and wider until we get to the right-hand side of the line to the 15th Brigade. more than 400 yards of open ground before the Australians can get to the German line. Brigadier General Pompey Elliott, in charge of the 15th Brigade, he tried his best to get the battle at least postponed. The Germans had been there for a year and a half. The Australians had been there for 1 week. The battle was meant to happen on the 17th of July, but because it rained, they postponed the battle. Pompey, he tries his best to get the battle postponed, but that is overruled, and at about 6 in the evening, we advance. On the left, we break through. In the middle, we break through. But for the Victorians of the 15th Brigade, they are virtually wiped out within the first 30 minutes. The main defensive feature is that thing there called the Sugarloaf Salient. No height to it as such, but it butts out into the line. And the machine gun on each corner of the Sugarloaf can shoot the entire length of no man's land to the right. The machine gun on the other corner can shoot the entire length of no man's land to the left. So the Australians and the British are advancing through observed artillery fire coming in from the heights of Fromelles and Aubers, also through frontal and enfilade sideways machine gun fire. The machine guns are set at grazing height, at knee height, so as they advance they are clipped at the knees. As they go down they are hit again and again. As a measure of the acumen of Sir Richard Haking, you see that virtual red line leading towards the Sugarloaf. In actuality, when he drew up the battle lines, there was a 30-yard buffer zone between the Australians and the British. His master plan, the Australians can sneak around the corner of the Sugarloaf and cut them off. The British can sneak around the other way and cut them off. No interdivisional contact. The attack is failing. He calls for another attack on the Sugarloaf at 9 p.m. that evening. The British General, Mackenzie, says, "We are too badly knocked around. We cannot possibly raise another attack on the Sugarloaf." That message goes back to Haking. He gets it at 8:25. 35 minutes for that message to get from there to Pompey to call off the attack. 2 companies of the 58th Battalion, lined up, ready to go. The 59th and 60th are virtually wiped out already, but 35 minutes for that message to get across, to hold back on that attack. That message never gets there, and 2 companies of the 58th Battalion go out against the Sugarloaf, and they too are wiped out. As a measure of the human tragedy of that one night's battle, 5,533 casualties, 2,000 killed, 1,336 missing, 480 prisoners. 26 pairs of brothers were killed that night, and 2 pairs of father and son. So just imagine being back home and getting that particular telegram: "Dear Sir, Madam, we regret to inform you." As I said, we broke through on the left and in the middle. Through the night, the Germans counterattack. We can't take the Sugarloaf. They can move along their own line, so the Australians who get into and beyond the so-called objective are cut off. In the morning, the call comes, "Get back if you can." But many are killed at the post trying to defend the ground that they have taken. This is a photograph of 53rd Battalion men just before they go over. The thing to note in this photograph, both for the Germans and the Allies, high walls, posts sunk into the ground with sandbagged walls and sally ports or doors where the men go out or they hop the bags and go over the top. A very high water table in Fromelles. But of the 8 soldiers here, only 3 came back, and they were wounded. This is the village of Fromelles. This is the main street of Fromelles. In the background is the shelled church of Fromelles. A lot of our work was based on the provenance, the information provided in photographs. On the left-hand side of the road here, we can see a light rail. All behind the German line, there's a network of light rail used to bring down their food, their ordnance, their equipment and the like. This becomes very significant in our subsequent research. This is a very sad photograph of an Australian soldier killed in the German line. We know through the war diaries of the 54th Battalion in the middle, where they broke through. They tried to build up sandbag walls to defend the ground that they had taken. In the morning, the call comes to get back. This soldier killed at that work, and most certainly among the soldiers that the Germans would have gathered and taken back for burial. The Germans must re-establish their defensive lines, clear their lines of their dead and our dead. It is a very sad photograph. It's almost recognisable to someone who would know him. The morning after the battle, the Germans offered the Australians a truce. The dead and the wounded could be gathered. However, the Australian General, General Mackay, he says no to that offer. He may, of course, have deferred to Butcher Haking and asked him, But he could have made a compassionate general's decision to allow the truce to proceed. The dead and the wounded could have been gathered, but the Australian General, General Mackay, he says no. We are in our lines. We can hear the calls from no man's land. Water, stretcher bearer, mother. They can see the movement out in no man's land. Arms being raised, calling for help. And we cannot stand down to those calls and that movement. And the Australians go out to try and bring in their wounded mates. This is a statue by Melbourne sculptor Peter Corlett called Cobbers. It depicts Sergeant Simon Fraser of the 57th Battalion carrying in a wounded cobber of the 60th Battalion. In his sector alone, before the Sugarloaf salient, they brought in 250 wounded men. In the days after the battle, as many as 30 Australian soldiers were killed doing the work of recovery, all because the Australian General Mackay said no. One soldier crawled back 10 days after the battle, surviving in the water of shell holes and in the rations of the packs of his dead cobbers. On one of his visits out into no man's land, Simon Fraser hears the call, "Don't forget me, cobber." And he goes back out there and brings that man in. Many acts of selfless courage. And here's the statue. We have a replica down at Melbourne, at the shrine there. And here it is. It has more than a military application. Yes, it invokes images of Simpson and his donkey on Gallipoli, wounded cobbers being supported along the Kokoda track in the Second World War, Trooper Donaldson VC under fire in Afghanistan, CSM Jack Kirby under fire at the Battle of Long Tan. But as I said, it has more than a military application. I believe that the qualities of selfless service and courage are demonstrated in an ongoing way through the work of our firefighters and our lifesavers. It's a wonderful statue. Sadly, Simon Fraser is among the missing of the Battle of Bulcourt a year later. The Germans were very active in the days after the battle. They took many photographs. This is something of a trophy photograph. Here's that light rail. Stacked high in the carts of the light rail are the bodies of Australian and or British soldiers being taken back somewhere behind their lines for burial. As I said, the Germans must re-establish their defensive lines. They clear their lines of their dead and our dead. For health reasons alone, they must get these soldiers back and bury them somewhere. Again, another photograph of soldiers killed at the Battle of Fromelles. I draw your attention to the soldier in the foreground with the light shirt and the arm missing. A lot of our work, as I said, was based on the provenance, the information provided in photograph. Very late in our research, we finally found a second photograph. And here it is. Clearly, it's the same group of soldiers. Here's our soldier in the foreground. But in the background, there is more information. Many crosses. These crosses are German crosses. This is the village of Fournon-Wep, which is the village behind Fromelles. That light rail went from behind the German front line all the way back through Fromelles, all the way back to Fawn. There are 50 soldiers in this photograph. This grave was recovered in 1923. They recovered 40 British and 10 Australian soldiers from that mass pit. The bodies recovered and reburied at Cabaret Rouge Cemetery, which was a designated post-war receiving cemetery for any recoveries post-war. One of these soldiers is Private Patrick Gearing of the 53rd Battalion, and here he is. This photograph of Patrick, taken before he goes off to war. As part of our research, our process of advocacy, a member of our team, John Fielding in Sydney, put an ad in a Sydney paper. 53rd Battalion, New South Wales, may be from Sydney. So he put a little classified ad in the back of the paper, trying to find descendants of Private Patrick Gearing to help make our case to take to Canberra. And remarkably, absolutely remarkably, this lady, she saw that ad. She replied to that ad. This is Sister Claudia, the daughter of Patrick Gearing. All these years, she had thought that he had been killed at the Battle of Pozières, not at Fromelles. We were able to contact her, tell her that her father had been killed at Fromelles, not at Pozières. What this series of slides demonstrates is the fact that what happened on the 19th of July 1916 is not ancient history, it is not distant or remote, it is extremely personal and extremely tangible. We were told quite often through the process, listen mate, you let this go, it's ancient history. But clearly, it is not. possibly the very last photograph of our soldiers before their burial. And interestingly enough, here they are in the shade of a line of trees or by the edge of a wood. It's high summer. The bodies have been gathered, placed in the shade of a line of trees to protect them from the sun. And here you'll notice that many of them, the bodies stacked all the way to the horizon, many of them have been covered by German ground sheets to protect them from the sun. They must get these bodies underground. I went to Fromelles again in 2002, and I went there with the question, where are the unaccounted for missing from the Battle of Fromelles? All of this Fromelles momentum is due to author, historian and friend Robin Caulfield, founder of the Friends of the 15th Brigade. He published a book in the year 2000 called Don't Forget Me, Cobber. He happened to choose and research a soldier called Jack Bowden, and it was his file, the only one in all 1,336 that mentioned a place called Pheasant Wood. So when I got back to Melbourne, I sent away to Canberra. I asked them, do you have any aerial photographs of the battlefield at Fromelles, the German lines? And they said, no, we don't. Sent away to England, trying to find aerial photographs of the battlefield and the ground beyond, trying to find anomalies in the ground. Eventually, a series of photographs began to emerge. Top left-hand corner, 17th of June 1916, 1 month before the battle. There's a light rail cutting through the corner of a wood, and before the wood, absolutely no digging at all. Then, 29th of July 1916, top middle, clear evidence of sustained earthwork. Clearly it wasn't Farmer Doug. The farmers had been evacuated from Fromelles. By Christmas time 1916, clearly the Germans had dug 8 pits and they filled in 5. By the end of the war, the villagers come back to expunge the memory of the war, get on with their lives. They see the 3 empty pits. By then the backfill has receded to the original level, and they fill them in to continue with their lives. So we put forward the case that this could be a likely burial site. We had to apply some political and some press pressure. We were told, go away, you amateur schmucks, you do not know what you are talking about. There couldn't possibly be a burial site that's been lost all these years behind the German lines. They're all accounted for at VC Corner Cemetery. So we had to apply some political pressure. There was a fair bit of tilting at windmills, rattling at the gates of the official gatekeepers of history. And having said that, I'm no Don Quixote. I'm more Sancho Panza, I think, than Don Quixote. But eventually, with the press pressure, because on July 18, 2003, it went public. Jonathan King on the front page of The Australian wrote a story on the missing of Fromelles. He pressed me for a figure. How many are there missing lamps? I don't know. This is all in the early stages of research. And he said he was persistent, so I offered the figure of 250. But we applied that pressure, questions were being asked, and eventually we were invited to Canberra to make our case to an expert panel, those official gatekeepers of history. Some of them said that these are probably gun pits. I'm not a military man. I can't see how or why you'd build a gun pit so close to the edge of a wood with a clearance of 1.5 meters. What this site did, it gave the Germans the line of sight cover provided by the wood to do the necessary work of preparation and burial. We put forward the proposition that this was a likely burial site. A close-up, the 1918 photograph. I believe if you look really closely, you can still see some height in the 2 pits closest to the edge of the wood, the 3 empty pits. Here we have a modern-day photograph of our proposed site. Even here, I believe you can detect some undulation in the ground, not empirical evidence, of course, in itself. However, when we found the landowner, she told us they tried to plant vegetables there, but the vegetables never grew there. They tried to plough the land, but it's too lumpy to plough. All that ever grew there were these strange little blue flowers. Nearby, a lot of infrastructure, high wire electricity, a NATO gas pipeline cuts very close to the actual site. And 30 years ago, Monsieur and Madame de Massier were approached to sell that specific land to a group of farmers who wanted to dig it up and put in ponds for carp. So they like to hunt, shoot and fish in Fromelles, but for one reason or another, they said no. So we had the aerial photographs suggesting that the ground before that particular wood was of interest. The second part in the research came by going through all 1,336 Red Cross wounded and missing files. And as I said, in Jack Bowden's file, the only one that mentioned a place called Pheasant Wood. Absolute serendipity chance, if you will. But Robin goes to Canberra before computers. Robin couldn't use a computer anyway, but Robin went back to Canberra, did his research. He happens to choose Jack Bowden to research. And in the end, it's his personal file that says Jack Bowden could be buried in one of 5 collective mass graves before Pheasant Wood, or in the collective grave number IM4.3 in the military cemetery at Thorn. And we all now know that that grave was recovered in 1923. So here's documentation from 1918 saying that Jack Bowden is buried before a place called Pheasant Wood in one of 5 collective graves, or in that grave which was recovered in 1923. So our circumstantial case was pretty strong. What the Germans did when they gathered the bodies, they took the ID discs off the bodies, if they still had them on, because at night, as our soldiers came back, they removed discs and brought them back. But any soldier that they gathered, they took the ID disc off. Anything that was not of any military value, cigarette cases, watches, Bibles and the like, they bagged them. And through the Red Cross, they sent them back to Australia, which is a remarkable thing to do. But what it does in the end, in terms of research, it gives us the names of the soldiers that they had buried, and, in the case of Jack Bowden, the only one, where they had buried them. We believed our case was very strong. In the end, there were 196 similar documents. So the Germans tell us who they've buried and where they've buried them. In 2006, 60 Minutes did a story on this, so it was well and truly on the public agenda. So people were asking questions. What are we going to do about this? Late in 2006, I approached Canberra, the German embassy there, and asked if they could do some research in Germany. Found Commander Franz Bierkel, the defence attaché in Canberra, and he contacted Germany. And in the end, someone in Germany found a German document in the archives in which it said, dated the 21st of July, 2 days after the battle, "You will prepare pits for 400 before Pheasant Wood." So there was no more evasive smoke. The ground had been used for burial purposes. We never found anything to suggest that the ground had ever been recovered. It wasn't a gun pit, it wasn't anything else, a rubbish dump, whatever. It had been used for burial purposes. So given the strength and the momentum of the case and the pressure applied by the press and some political pressure, they agreed to engage Tony Pollard from Glasgow University. I don't know if you watch it on BBC, 2 Men in a Trench. Tony Pollard and his team were engaged to go to Fromelles to investigate the site. Now here's Pheasant Wood. This is our very good friend Martial Delabarre, something of a local in Fromelles. His family have lived there for 700 years, so he does qualify. But Martial, a very good friend, he works as a gardener for the War Graves Commission, and he's our go-to person in Fromelles. He established a museum there, a local commemorative group. He's a very good friend. In 1923, an Australian major went to Pheasant Wood, to Fromelles, to look for the missing. But by the time he gets there, it looks a lot like this, just overgrown grass. This area is leased to another farmer who cuts it twice a year for agistment purposes to feed the local farm animals. Now I went back to Fromelles to be there for the non-invasive investigation, and I'd been in Fromelles for a week and a half before I went down there. I'd never been to Pheasant Wood before. All of this was research-based. I'd walked past it hundreds of times, but given that Tony Pollard and his team were there, the next day I thought we better go down and have a look. Very lush grass, a very warm afternoon, so I took the opportunity to have a rest in that lush grass. The next day, the team were there with their clever technology. This is me with my clever technology. It's about all I can handle. This is going to be Plan 61B. That's the very cunning plan where I go to Le Bunnings in Paris. I get a shovel, a flashlight, a balaclava, and a good French lawyer. However, having followed due and official process, because the only way we're ever going to get there was by following that process, they were finally there with their clever technology, which is a ground-penetrating radar, sophisticated metal detectors. The significance of this particular photograph, the flags. Wherever they got a metallic hit, they flagged it and they bagged it. Found more than 700 items of military junk. Bullets, shrapnel balls, shell casings and the like. But there was a general scatter pattern right across the front of Pheasant Wood, suggesting that the ground had not been disturbed. Anything buried there, most likely, was still buried there. That general scatter pattern was a carpet of debris. As well as all that junk, they found two distinctly Australian items. One was a heart-shaped medallion with Anzac written on it. The other one was this, an inverted horseshoe, not a good idea in the first place, an inverted horseshoe with Shire of Alberton, AIF, written on it. Alberton, a little village just beyond Yarram on the 90-mile beach. A member of our team, Tim Mitford, his great uncle was Harry Willis, and here's Harry. I draw your attention to the young boy on the left there. That young boy is Harry Willis. He's one of 14 brothers and sisters. Here he is standing at a farmhouse in Alberton, just a little village of 200 or so. That farmhouse is still there. By the time the war had come around, he already had 3 brothers on Gallipoli. Before they left, they said, you stay home, you look after the family. Over one day in the post, he receives the white feather, the symbol, the accusation of cowardice. He cannot stand down the accusation. He forges his mother's signature and he goes off to war. You can't stay on in a village of 200 or so. They won't serve you in the shop. No one will dance with you at the local dance. So he forges his mother's signature and he goes off to war. My good friend Tim Mitford, he is the grandnephew of Harry Willis. There are many, many links in a very, very strange chain of coincidence right throughout this process. That good luck charm that came out of the ground belonged to Harry Willis, his great uncle. So there's that personal, tangible link. Here's young Harry. He's only 19. Can't top his belt buckle yet. This photograph taken at Broadmeadows camp for 6 months training. Here he is again. This photograph taken at Tel El Kabir in Egypt for another 6 months training. Then they get on the ship and they go off to France. Here he is looking more and more like a soldier. As I said, the Germans were very active in the days after the battle. They took many photographs. This soldier here in the foreground, we believe him to be Harry Willis. This was his journey. We know through his Red Cross file that he was shot through the jaw. This soldier is bandaged around the jaw. He has the 31st Battalion colour patch. Had the photograph sent to one of the world's top forensic anthropologists. And she indicated quite strongly that the facial features suggest that this is indeed Harry Willis. That good luck charm that came out of the ground belonged to Harry Willis. Yet another link in that strange chain of coincidence. Tim Whitford's great uncle. So, given the clever technology, the extrapolation of all the clever technology and data, they re-engaged Tony Pollard to go back in 2008 to actually dig. The only way you're going to find out for sure is to dig. On the first night, once the press had gone, Tim and I were invited on site to view what they had done, and you could see the original, because they removed the topsoil, got down to the original level. You could see the absolute pencil line straightness of the edges of the pits and the difference in the colour of the clay, indicating quite strongly that the ground had not been disturbed. Anything buried there was still buried there. So once they reached the original level, they dug a sondage or a test pit and went down deeper. Very late on the second night, Paula Tataro, a top journalist, did many articles with The Age. She said, I reckon they've found something. A lot of hushed conversations in the corner of the compound, a lot of photographing taking place, no eye contact as the team left the site that night. The following morning, as part of the process, they call in the police to view what they have found. The night before, they had found an arm coming out of the clay, minus its hand. So the site was still intact. They make the official announcement on the third morning. Here's Tim. After he gets the news, the first thing he does, he gets on the phone to his Nana back in Yarram to give the news. Nana, the site is intact. Nana, there's a good chance that Harry is here, because after all, they had found his good luck charm on the edge of pit number 4 the year before. And here his daughter, Alexandra, offers her father some comfort. Very personal, very tangible. They were there for 3 weeks to determine the status of the ground. Yes, it was a burial site, to get an idea of the numbers if they could, and the state of the remains. They weren't allowed to remove anything. They found a lot of artefacts. Very late into the second week, they finally found some identifying metal. Here we have the Rising Sun badge. You recall the photograph of the 53rd Battalion men before they go over? None of them are wearing their identifying medal. Maybe the assaulting battalions took them off to deprive the Germans of any sort of intelligence. Before we went over to France, Suzanne and I, we saw our son off at his induction. Anthony had gone and joined the Australian Army. I was still in Fromelles when he gave me a phone call. I was in VC Corner Cemetery when I took that phone call. So the irony and the symbolism of taking a phone call from my Australian soldier's son was not missed by me. I'm not the hard bastard I look. As well as that bit of identifying metal, they found this little innocuous button. It is a British service button, suggesting there are also British soldiers buried here. This little button is without a doubt the most expensive button in British military history, because this now meant that the British government had to pay half the costs. I suspect there might be some Australian DNA in that button. Maybe Mike O'Brien might have planted it, or Roger Lee. Here we have the wonderful Madame de Massier. She is the landowner at Pheasant Wood. When she learnt that her land might be a possible mass burial site, she was sympathetic. She allowed the work to proceed. She herself had lost 2 uncles in the Great War, one of whom was missing. So she allowed that work to proceed. They'd been there for the 3 weeks, and what they did was to cover them up to wait a political determination as to how they would proceed here. Would they put up a monument saying, believed buried here, Australians of the 5th Division, British of the 61st Division? Or would they recover this site, give these men the dignity of individual reburial? There was a raging debate going on back in Australia as to what should happen now. And we were invited on site for the one visit, and I can assure you it was a very grim sight. We knew who the majority of them were by name. The Germans told us who they'd buried. So when we got back, we advocated very strongly we must recover this site. Our missing could not be a logistical or a financial inconvenience. But the debate raged. But here, Madame de Massier, Tony Pollard and his team did remarkable work. It wasn't just an act of archaeology of science. It was very personal work. But at the end of that service, Madame came forward and she laid a wreath with her grandson Guillaume Moril, and this is a translation of what was on that wreath. To our Australian brothers who died at the Battle of Fromelles in 1916, the 19th and 20th of July are days which will forever link the history of our 2 countries. During that very difficult period of the Great War, you came from the other side of the world, voluntarily and filled with courage, to fight at our sides to preserve our freedom. Your spirit will never be lost from our land and our hearts. We've been brothers until death. You had your blood spilled for us, and there is no bond stronger than that. From the bottom of our hearts, we express our eternal gratitude for your sacrifice. You will never leave our hearts. Guillaume Moril, a sentiment shared by the village. Madame and Guillaume laid that wreath. Then she went and sought the officials who were there, and she declared to them, this land no longer belongs to me. I give it to the soldiers. A remarkable gesture from a wonderful lady. We love her. Thankfully, the decision was made to go back. Had we left them like that, it would have sent a really bad message to our current serving people. 2008 was a remarkable year in terms of our military heritage and our legacy. Ted Graham and his team, they found HMAS Sydney absolutely wonderful. And Jim Burke and his group of Vietnam War veteran friends, they made a promise and they kept their promise. And our 6 missing Vietnam War service people eventually were all found, recovered and brought home. Remarkable work from Jim Burke and his team. And in 2008, Pheasant Wood was confirmed. Thankfully, the decision was made to go back and recover the site in 2009. They engaged Oxford Archaeology to do that work of recovery. They opened all 8 pits and they recovered 250 soldiers from those pits. January the 30th, 2010, the original site was at the bottom of a slope and too prone to flooding, so the village secured some land and they built the brand new Pheasant Wood Military Cemetery, Fromelles. January the 30th, 2010, what we've been advocating for all this time. The very first of the burials, one of our own, carried in by his own to his dignified burial. Over a period of 3 weeks, they buried 249 soldiers. They held one soldier over for ceremonial burial, the dedication of the new cemetery on the anniversary of the battle, 2010. Here we have Australian Army Chaplain Katie Inches Ogden reading over the very first of those burials. The call had gone out right across Australia. If you had a soldier lost at the Battle of Fromelles, come forward, offer us your family tree. We'll try and find a DNA giver to try and match your soldier. So that panel sat. Remarkable artefacts came out of the ground there. Here we have an Australian belt buckle, a box of matches. 3 soldiers were found with their ID discs still on them, so they were easily identifiable. This remarkable thing, very hard to see. It's an ampule of iodine, very fragile thing, survived all those years in the tight clay of Pheasant Wood. Each soldier went over the top that night in their dressing kit, iodine, bandages if wounded, snap it open, pour it over your wound to stop infection. A rising sun badge, a Bible with underlined sections through it. Clearly the soldier would come back and refer to those verses. Many poignant finds. They found a boomerang medallion with "Return to Me" engraved on it. In the waterproof section of a gas mask, they found a train ticket, returned 2nd class, Fremantle to Perth, clearly placed there by that soldier as a good luck charm, a talisman, a reminder of home. They found a leather pouch stitched at the edges, inside a lock of human hair and a note. Many poignant finds. They found a watch with a name on it, so they were making identifications, but the call went out for the DNA. An Australian boot. Remarkable artefacts came out of those pits. Here we have a statuette by Melbourne sculptor again, by Peter Corlett, based on a letter which my good friend Tim Whitford found in the archives, a letter written by Mrs. Alice Goulding. And Kate Bailey, you volunteered again to read that letter. Kate's grandfather was at the Battle of Fromelles. He survived the Battle of Fromelles, but not the war.
Dear Sir, I'm writing to inquire of my son, John Joseph Goulding, number 555, B Company, 31st Battalion, AIF, who was reported missing since July 19th, 1916. I haven't received anything belonging to him, but a disc was sent from Germany sometime during 1917 with a promise that further inquiries would be made and I'd be notified. I've heard no further of him. If only I could know that he didn't suffer too much from the Huns if he fell in their hands, which I've reason to believe during that dreadful slaughter of Fleur Bay, of which thousands of Australian mothers has reason to think seriously. My son left Australia to do his bit for the country. He was born in England. He didn't stand long, but I do hope that something further will be made known to me. Although 3 years has passed, it seems but as yesterday, and I'm still waiting. First missing, then prisoner of war, then killed in action. I know he wasn't the only one by thousands, but he was my son. I just lent to me for 35 years and then missing. I know a good son, I believe a good man, but don't know if a good soldier. He's paid the price as many others have done, but in all the world there is no love like a mother's love for her children, if she's ever so poor, if a true woman. I've been trying to be patient for 3 years, hoping, but just today I thought, perhaps you've forgotten. But this I know, that the war has just begun for mothers that dearly love their boys all over the world. God help them to bear it. The suspense is what makes it so hard. Hoping this mail will bring some tidings, or the next but one. I cannot write more, and I know you don't want to read more. May I please ask, will you try and find out if any record of him, my boy, and oblige? Signed, Mrs. J. Alice Goulding.
Thank you, Kate. To be on the working list of those buried at Pheasant Wood. In yet another link in that strange chain of coincidence, Mrs. Goulding passed away on the 19th of July 1922 on the anniversary of the battle. Perhaps she died of a broken heart. Thankfully, this statue will be struck, a full-scale version of this statue, and it will go to Ballarat, to the Avenue of Honour, to the little park on the left of the road before you go through the Arch of Victory, and will be unveiled, I think, on the 7th of February next year. So she'll be a welcome addition to the National Estate, and I anticipate that every Anzac Day, Remembrance Day and Mother's Day, there'll be showers of flowers at her feet. It's a wonderful statue. Now we have this joyous and wonderful photograph. March 16, 2010, Suzanne's birthday. Tim's at home in the morning, gets a call from Canberra to say that Harry Willis has been identified. A wonderful moment for Tim and for the family. He rang me up, picked me up. We went down to Yarram to give his nana the news. And here they are reunited. Young Harry Willis, Nana Marjorie Whitford and Tim Whitford. A joyous, wonderful photograph. My absolute privilege to have been there when it was taken. There is some sad symmetry to the photograph because since it was taken, Nana Whitford has passed away. But she lived long enough to learn that Harry had been found, had been given his dignity and his identity, and it was her DNA sample that did it. A joyous and wonderful photograph. This one is less so. I went over again. We went over in 2010 for the service, the dedication of the new cemetery. I was allowed into the cemetery. I'm saying hello to Harry Willis. But they had the wrong death date on Harry's headstone. He was one of the 37 listed at Villers Brettoneux Memorial. That clerical error from 1916 compounded in 2010. I sought out the officials who were still there getting the cemetery ready, and I said, listen, the date on this headstone is wrong. Any Australian soldier killed on the 21st of July was back in no man's land doing the work of recovery. They said our official records show that he was killed on the 21st of July. It's a bit late now. It would be expensive to change, and we prefer a day's notice before we talk to you. I said, hello, I'm kind of used to that kind of treatment. So what I did, I got on the phone to my good friend Tim Whitford, who's still back in Australia, and I gave him the news. He was devastated and very angry, dismayed. You don't get Tim angry. But he contacted Major General Mike O'Brien and asked me, please tell me this is not so. And in the end, Harry's headstone and 3 others were changed to the correct date. Another reason why I don't look quite so happy there, the Friday night before we left to go over to France, I was watching Carlton play North Melbourne, and we were being soundly beaten. Things were not going well for Carlton or indeed myself. I was having a heart attack or a stroke. Went off to the Alfred Hospital, checked in there, went to the waiting room, turned the telly over the footy, was still being soundly beaten. I ended up getting Bell's palsy. That's that thing that stuffs up your face, turns you into the hunchback of Notre Dame. You can't speak properly. You can't eat or drink properly. I had to poke the food over with my finger and drink sideways, and with my Quasimodo-like appearance, I scared the little children of Fromelles and several dogs across the other side of the street. The real tragedy, of course, in Fromelles, a lot of hospitality to be had in that wonderful village, and I can never, ever be rude. So Brenton, that's why I let the whiskers grow a little bit, just to hide the residue of the palsy, and maybe it makes me look a little bit intelligenterer than I really is. So a vain hope, maybe. Now, I'm a bit of an old Greek, wired towards sentimentality, but in the days before the service, I went down to the original burial site before Pheasant Wood, and as I looked around, I noticed those little blue flowers that Madame had told us about. I thought, hello, here are these little blue flowers. But as I looked around, I noticed they were only growing on the 5 pits that had bodies in them. I thought, hello, that's a little bit strange. I'll go to the 3 empty pits which similarly had been turned over, airing the ground and promoting the growth of weeds and flowers, but they weren't growing there. In the days before the service, these little blue flowers only grew on the 5 pits that had bodies in them. There's probably an excellent botanical reason for it, but I don't know what it is. Someone has suggested they're indeed forget-me-nots. I don't know. Tim and I were both honoured by the village on the day of the service, and he discussed it with the family, and they brought back Harry's good luck charm profile and a photograph to donate to the village, which will go on display in the new museum. A wonderful honour for both of us. Look at that tragic head on the right. I think I'll skip this. Okay, July 19, 2010, one of the hottest days that France has seen. Here we have the soldier, the last of the soldiers, being brought in. Here's the Pheasant Wood Military Cemetery. And again, here he is being carried in to be reunited with the soldiers of Pheasant Wood. In attendance, Prince Charles and Her Excellency Quentin Bryce. Her Excellency has a very strong bond with Fromelles, having walked the ground at Pheasant Wood before the soldiers had been recovered, having laid a wreath at VC Corner Cemetery, having found time for quiet and personal repose in the village church of Fromelles, for thinking of Madame de Massier and sending her a gift, one which she proudly shows to all of her visitors, and for officiating at the opening of the new cemetery. So here he is being carried in soon-to-be blessed and consecrated ground, no longer in anonymous dirt. I believe that there is a collective ownership of this ground. After the service, the families got to go in. At this stage, 96 Australian soldiers had been identified using artefacts and DNA. That figure is now 144, and a couple of years ago, as Kate now knows, Goulding was identified. They found DNA in outback Queensland, so Goulding now has a marked headstone. The process will continue. There were no identifications last year, but there will be this year. Identifying one was wonderful, but 144 is sensational. So as I said, for me, the 8-year process when the families got to go in to make their pilgrimage, to make their link with their soldier, was very significant. So here's Tim saying hello to his great uncle, Harry Willis. In the days after the service, the wonderful Madame de Massier saying hello to Harry. Before Tim came over, he went back to Alberton to the farmhouse, took leaves from the gum tree, went to the graves of Harry's parents and of his nana, and brought soil over to place over Harry's grave. All acts of remembrance. The young man on the far right there, that's Guillaume Moril, the grandson of Madame de Massier, the author of the note that I read out before. A couple of years back, Guillaume was awarded the Sadleir Stokes Scholarship, an annual award to a student in the north of France to come out to Australia for an Australian experience in their chosen field of interest. Guillaume is a farmer. While he was here, we helped to host him. We got him a job at the Hillsville Sanctuary, where he looked after the dingoes. While mending a fence in outback Queensland, he met a taipan. While trekking through Tasmania, he met a tiger snake. But while he was here, I took the opportunity to take him to the centre of the universe, to the MCG, to see Carlton demolish Richmond with a little bit of Favola magic. But I think my real contribution to Franco-Australian relations and to culture was to teach him how to say dickhead, which when delivered by a French person is really quite poetic and quite lilting. Now we open with a slide of VC Corner Cemetery and we'll close with a slide of VC Corner Cemetery. We've already established the fact that I am somewhat wired towards sentimentality, but I somehow believe that the 410 Australian soldiers buried at Pheasant Wood would welcome the company and the activity of 2 young Australian children at play in that cemetery. So now the soldiers of Pheasant Wood, they've been restored to their families, and they've been restored to us. Thank you. Now, before we open for questions, I understand that Joy has some questions. Here's the mic, Joy.
Now, before I open the floor for everybody else to ask a question, I have here from Clive Smith, who's up here taking the film, so he can't ask the question. It's a question about other Sorrento boys or Sorrento boys at Fromelles. And this is the evidence that Clive has researched. Albert George Hibbert from Sorrento was the third son of George and Mary Sophia Hibbert, near Lyons. He worked with his father in a lemonade business, so many of you will know a little bit about that. At the outbreak of the war, he was married to Mary, near Chapman. Albert enlisted on July the 12th, 1915. His older brother Frank and younger brother Cecil would enlist on July the 15th, and their youngest brother James just under a year later on May the 11th, 1916. Only two of them, Frank and James, would return. William Christopher Brumby was an Englishman, presumably resident in Sorrento. Ernest George White was the eldest son of George and Mary White, near Dark, and survived the war. Albert, William and Ernest enlisted at around the same time in early July 1915. Albert and William on the same day. Sadly, Albert and William were also to die on the same day, just over a year later. All three men were in the 31st Battalion in C Company and embarked together from Melbourne on the HMT Wandilla on December the 7th, 1915. Despite being an Englishman, William Brumby's file contains a reference to a Mrs. G. White of Sorrento, sending effects left by him, presumably back in Sorrento, to his sister in Lincolnshire. This gives us a clue as to why he has his place of association as Sorrento, especially given that it's highly likely that Mrs. G. White was the Mrs. G. White who was Ernest George White's mother. Albert and William's deaths were recorded by the Australian War Memorial as on the 21st of July 1916 in France. Their memorial is listed as Villers-Bretonneux Memorial, Villers-Bretonneux, Picardy in France. Lambis, what do you think about that situation?
Okay.
It's a long question for people who haven't got it in front of them. Lambis has seen it.
I was given notice, and both soldiers were among those listed at Villers-Bretonneux, the clerical error from 1916. So it's very important, Clive. No pressure, Clive, but you've got to find descendants of both of those soldiers and give them their chance. They were listed as missing at Villers-Bretonneux. Their names will be transferred probably to VC. We'll see what the process is, but yes.
Can I talk now?
You certainly may.
Thanks. I'm going to take this one step further. In September, late September this year, I was fortunate enough to visit VC Corner Fromelles for the second time in 14 months. My pilgrimage there was actually the culmination of a 12-month research from an interest which became an obsession about these two boys, Will Brumby and Albert George Hibbert, and with a lot of agitating through the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, I can actually say now, breaking news, that their names have been transferred from the memorial wall at Villers-Bretonneux to now the memorial wall at VC Corner.
Well done. Being a rat bag is not an exclusive club, Peter. You've got to agitate. You've got to ask questions and follow through. So hopefully in time, if we can find descendants, if the soldier had a sister who had a daughter, they might find mitochondrial DNA, and hopefully in time, if you've got to give the soldier the chance. There were no files in the Red Cross files on either of them, which was very annoying. But I mean, the family must register and offer their nominated DNA to give that soldier his chance.
DNA's being tested, isn't it?
DNA's being tested.
Sensational. Good. Well, fingers crossed. Are there any questions? Yeah. Are there biscuits along with the coffee? Are there any questions? Yes.
Can I make one comment?
Certainly.
In a very kind introduction to you, I think it was mentioned that you got an OAM. I thought you got an AM. Isn't it?
Post noms, Lambis Englezos AMRAB, rat bag and bar. I don't know the difference yet.
Famous Wayne, I obviously wasn't in World War I, but I was in another war. But what on your pictures got all these graves overseas, and we've still got 21 Vietnam veterans buried overseas with none missing now. Is it time we perhaps have an Arlington type ceremony at Canberra, so we bring our dead back and have a stone monument for them rather than now buried in overseas cemeteries?
It's all very tricky. It all goes back to the original question, the moral dilemma, if you will, whether we should engage in this, actively seeking our war dead. Our American friends, they get it. They actively seek their war dead through JPAC. No begrudgment. Our British friends are too war weary and we're too stoic. To the point of bringing soldiers back, the 6 missing Vietnam War service people were brought home. But if you already have a burial with a headstone, I think that's maybe, opinions will vary. Maybe that's where you stay. I don't know. But there are lots of things going on. There are even here locally, many of the damaged men who came back from the war went into institutional care, died in there, weren't claimed by their families and were buried in pauper graves. In many instances, their headstones have been removed and they're tinselled up at Springvale Cemetery, just row after row of a name. But back where their point of burial is, they've just got a tin plate with an initial, a surname and a date of death, and that's all they've got. There's some abrogation of responsibility there. A lot of tokenism associated with the centenary of Anzac, but I think another job of work that we're doing is trying to mark the graves of our soldiers. But your point about bringing them home, they're finding bodies on a regular basis. Depending on where they are, I think the mindset is changing to the point where they will bring them back. They're doing work in New Guinea. I was approached recently by a man who may have found Siflete, Sergeant Siflete, the iconic image of the Second World War, the soldier on the beach about to be beheaded. We believe we have his exact location of burial. And he has a 92-year-old brother. So, we are hopeful that they will go there soon and recover that site. They're doing more work in New Guinea, the demilitarised zone in Korea. It's a very tricky situation, so they are working. See, I'd like to thank the Australian Army for having established and maintained a process which eventually brought us to confirmation and to recovery at Pheasant Wood. But I mean, there's a lot more work to be done. There's work at Krithia. There are other sites in France at Bulcourt. But again, it's part of that process. There's some people say it's sufficient to have a name carved onto a stone wall or cast in bronze or painted onto a panel. But I believe if we can do better, we should. If we can find our war dead, we should recover them. Sydney's in deep water. HMAS Perth in the Second World War is in shallow water in the Sundar Strait. We've learnt that there's a commercial salvaging operation over Perth. 355 sailors went down on the Perth, but Canberra were very reluctant to make any noise. But our Indonesian friends said we're not fussed by that. So as we speak, HMAS Perth is being salvaged, and there are sailors in that ship. We're hopeful that we'll make even more noise, maybe approach the Chinese and have them call off the commercial salvages. But I mean, there's a certain dignity to be had right throughout this process. But if a soldier is buried overseas and has a headstone, maybe the Arlington process is too tricky. I don't know. You'll have your personal opinion. We'll all have a personal opinion on that. But if a soldier has a burial, a named burial, that should be sufficient, maybe. But on another note, there are things happening which we need to be aware of, and hopefully Campbell will be more proactive.
No, thank you so much, Lambis, and obviously a very, very moving story and a great success for so many of the descendants of these people. I want to now call on Peter Munro, who's already leapt up once and taken over. That's okay. Peter is an Nepean Historical Society member, a researcher of local history, but particularly of local servicemen, and a tour guide. And Peter's going to do the official vote of thanks. Thank you, Lambis.
Thank you, Joy, and thank you for giving me the honour of proposing a vote of thanks to Lambis. I'm going to start with a coincidence, and I'll just take your indulgence for a couple of moments. Let's go back to the end of September last year, and Judy and I were in a little town on the eastern extremity of the Somme called St. Quentin, and Lambis would know it rather well. And we were concluding our last part of the pilgrimage, where we had actually been only the week before, walking the ground that Lambis has walked many times before at Fromelles, and also in the Flanders area of Belgium. But this day, Judy was going to drive because she didn't trust her navigating, and I did the navigating, and we planted the last of the crosses of the Sorrento boys, whose names appear on the memorial down on the front beach for 5 graves that concluded our pilgrimage. And we got back to the hotel about 5 o'clock and whisked through the emails. There was one that caught my eye, and we had a special meeting to catch up with a very good friend of mine. He was my battlefields guide in 2014. We became firm friends after that, communicated quite a lot, and he helped me with the uncovering of the 2 names which have just been mentioned to get them recognised on the memorial wall of Fromelles. His name was Sylvestre Bresson. And yes, Lambis, I know you don't. And as we met with Sylvestre and his wife in the town square of St. Quentin, we talked about exchanging pleasantries, and halfway through the conversation he said, "Oh, by the way, have you caught up with Lambis lately?" I said, "How did you remember?" And he said, "Well," he said, "you were here last year with me, and you said that you were a school teacher, and he's a school teacher, and you had that connection." I said, "Well, it's interesting you say that, Sylvestre, because I've just checked my emails an hour ago, and one of them comes from a member of the little society," yes, Janet, it's you, little society that I come from down the peninsula. And Janet was telling me things, and Janet's a very, very respected friend of mine, and she said, "Oh, by the way," just at the bottom of the email, "we've been very fortunate to obtain the services of Lambis." So here we are in St. Quentin. I've got the email from Janet. We're talking about Lambis. Pretty amazing. That's a coincidence anyway. I had first heard Lambis speak about 4 or 5 years ago. I can't remember. My memory's fading. And it was at Anzac House in the city. And Lambis spoke to a group of retired school principals. At that stage, I don't think a lot of us knew a lot about Fromelles and precious little about Pheasant Wood, but we were all struck with the passion and the energy and the verve that he showed then and is still showing today. He's still taking the cause up, and that is very, very admirable. I also came in contact with Lambis last July, very briefly, because he was much in demand. It was July the 19th, 2015. It was the 99th anniversary commemoration of the Battle of Fromelles. And as I sat in the back row, and Lambis was actually the MC at the time, I was struck by the people who came up and gave the dedications of the poppies, and it seemed to me like it was one Fromelles family. I was amazed that Lambis was able to talk about each person as they came up. It was a personal sort of thing, and I think he has brought out the Fromelles story, which hitherto was a very, very unannounced story. It was swept under the carpet, as one of the historians, Peter Barton, says. It was an unmitigated disaster, and you know that now from what you've seen tonight. But he's put it front and centre, and that is really important in the centenary year of the Battle of Fromelles. I know you're going to take on more conquests, as I'm sure you will, and I ask all of you to, when you are going down to the memorial, down on the front beach, to have a look at the panel which says "Killed in Action," and it starts with Arthur Boxall and it finishes down with George Williams. And for every name that has a known grave, the Sorrento boys, there is a name that has no known grave, one for one. Lambis, we thank you very much for your presentation tonight. And we'd like you to accept this little gift, and I'd really ask the audience to show your warm appreciation for this presentation. Thanks, mate.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter. Cheers. I'll put it to good use.
Thank you, Peter. And I want to especially thank Kate Bayou for coming and reading that really very moving letter. I think it sums up for thousands and thousands of women in all the wars, but it's just so simply written, but so very powerful, Kate. So, and I know difficult for you to read too, and difficult for us to listen to. Thank you very much. That was beautiful. So we wish Lambis and Suzanne, of course, a very special tour this year when they go back to Europe for the 100th anniversary of Fromelles. Next month, on the 4th of March, our speaker will be Stuart Duff from the Police Historical Society, and he's going to be speaking about policing colonial Victoria and giving us an insight into the problems of law enforcement from 1834 to 1856. So a very different sort of story we'll hear. If you haven't already, please sign. Bye. I have to say bye. He's going to turn it off. I need to say something.